Hey all, how you doing? Happy Monday. It's April 6th. All the days seem to run together, but I guess the calendar tells me today is Monday. So I hope you're doing well and are healthy and your family and friends are all healthy too, remaining in isolation as we all need to. So last week we took a look at government regulation and governance structures around environmental issues, and we looked at some sort of top-down federal type regulation, and then took a look at some more participatory, grassroots, bottom-up ideas about regulation. And I hope you saw that some governance obviously can be a solution to some environmental problems. In fact, our government regulations in this country, in the United States, have really improved over the last 40 or 50 years, our environmental quality. Even though we still have some problems, we have solved some of our problems by having strong regulation. So this week we're going to look at some economic systems and how those may or may not help with some environmental issues. So here's a good place to start. This is a lovely diagram that I found online that kind of shows how you go from the resource attributes, in other words, the what we find in nature, the non-human part of nature, the physical aspects. So that might be coal that's in the ground, or timber, or fish in the ocean, any kind of resource that we might use. We've talked about already how those can be thought of as ecosystem services. And really, the idea of economic systems is to harvest those resources and have human inputs like labor to produce something, right? To make something. Maybe it's a good, maybe it's a service, and then to sell that, or in other words, get it to other people in some way through some sort of transactions. And the idea is that people benefit from that, right? And then there are feedbacks that go back into managing and manipulating those resources for the next round of production. So economic systems are a lot about what is being produced, who's doing the production, who owns that resource, who owns the means of production, who is benefiting from that production, and who might not be benefiting. That's a very broad look at economic systems, but hopefully you can see how obviously these are related to natural resource management and really environmental problems and solutions in a big way. This is an even better diagram that really kind of lays out in some detail the different economic systems of the world. So if you look at this quickly, on the green side here, it says profit motive, and on the reddish side, pinkish side, it says non-profit motive. I think there's probably profit motive on both sides, but in general, the green side is a little bit more toward the capitalism end. In other words, individuals are seeking to make profit. And on the pinkish side here, there's less of that profit motive built into the system. The top part of this circle is indicating there's more central control, more top-down control, and on the bottom we have less top-down control. So let's take a look at a few of these. In the United States, probably the system most of us are used to kind of is in this area here, state-regulated capitalism slash mixed state-regulated private enterprise capitalism. So that means that most of our industries are privately owned, and the state really does not own that. By the state, we mean the country, the nation, the United States in this example. The United States does not really own most of those businesses, but it regulates them. We saw that last week, how the Clean Water Act, for example, or CERCLA, the Superfund law, kind of regulates what some of those industries can do. You could imagine a situation where the state, the nation, did own most of the businesses and operates them. That could be capitalism that's more state-owned. You could imagine a situation where you had even less regulation, so private enterprise capitalism or even free enterprise capitalism, where there's very little state regulation and you just let the market sort of determine what sort of capitalism can happen. So those are varying degrees of regulation in capitalism. And I want you to understand we in the United States are definitely in what's called a mixed economy. So we do have private enterprise, of course, that drives most of our economy, but it's regulated pretty heavily by the nation and state governments and so on. Down at the bottom here, you could have anarchy, where you had no laws or regulations at all, and no private property. Everyone's for him or herself. That's not exactly the way most nations exist, but it made the chart here. On the left side, we have varying degrees of socialism. So at this top, you have state socialism, where the state owns and operates the industries, not so much for a profit, but for the overall social objectives, whatever that nation has agreed upon. You could, as you move down the circle here, have a little bit more of a democratic socialism, what Bernie Sanders might be aiming for. Private property permitted for consumer goods, but the state owns all capital and land. So this might be a situation where the government controls a lot of the land and the resources, but private enterprise can happen beneath that. As you get down to this part of the curve, it says utopian. A lot of these are kind of ideas that haven't really emerged exactly. A perfectly compatible and cooperative community where the state withers away and there are no antagonistic classes. We haven't really seen a society develop in that way. Although I suppose you could say maybe some of our early foraging ancestor groups, bands of 20 to 50 people, maybe operated in something this way. I'm sure it wasn't totally utopian and without antagonism, but in some way they managed to coexist without having a central authority, without having a government, and more or less shared resources, we think, in a way that allowed all of them to survive, at least for a little while. So it's possible that there might have been something like that at some point in our distant past. So that's a pretty good look at some of the options that are available. Here's another little chart that might help you understand this a little bit. Across the top it says resource allocation. So resources, natural resources like coal and timber and fish, owned by the market, in other words, privately traded on the market, or are they commanded by the central government? And then down the left side, we have private and state ownership of resources. So who controls the ownership and who controls the allocation of resources? Here's yet another little graph or line that shows kind of maybe how some of these play out on a hierarchy or a polar type model. So here's some of the utopian sort of Marxist communist utopia. Here, according to this author anyway, is American conservatives and American liberals. A lot of times those are portrayed as being polar opposites in our political system, when in fact, in the big picture, they might be actually pretty close together. Here's social democracy, what some of our senators and representatives are clamoring for right now. And then here might be anarchy, where it's everyone for themselves. So again, you can decide if you like this way of portraying it or not, but it kind of shows some of the different sorts of economic systems on kind of a timeline sort of thing. Okay, so what I want to do first here is take a look at capitalism and think about a little bit of how it works, and then mostly look at how it might relate to this idea of environmentalism. So capitalism is an economic system in which the means of production of goods or services are privately owned and operated for a profit. You know this, right? This is the way the United States pretty much operates. And you could say we are a regulated capitalism because all this occurs under the umbrella of federal and state and even local regulations that sort of set the rules for how this can happen. So pretty clearly there are some benefits, and pretty clearly there are some problems of capitalism. So let's look at the advantages first. First of all, it's efficient. It is good at using resources in an efficient way. It does provide some freedom, right? So you have freedom for what you want to purchase, and businesses have freedom for how they want to acquire resources, or where they want to acquire resources, how they want to acquire labor, how they want to produce whatever they want to produce, how they want to market it. There is freedom, for the most part, under that umbrella of regulation. It is true that capitalism has led to a growth in living standards. If you compare sort of the average standard of living in the United States or even the world over the last century, it's hard to argue that it hasn't improved. Now, has it improved equally for all? No, it has not. But if you look at sort of the average standard of living, it has gone up. There's this idea of creative destruction, which isn't really destruction of natural resources, but it's the idea that capitalism can reinvent itself. So whatever is the commodity that's being produced and marketed today, next year it might be something else, and the market can shift to that. It can shift from using different resources that might be cheaper or more available from ones that might be more scarce. So it's always kind of reinventing itself. And there's this argument that there's no better alternative. That is somewhat debatable, but we can think about that as we go through this. There are some problems of capitalism that many people have pointed out, and I'll just go around the circle here. First of all, it in some ways is a system of inequality, because if resources and opportunities are privately owned, that means I might own some and therefore you don't, right? And so it is a system of, making money from resources. It is a for-profit system, and that means some people profit and others do not. Economic instability. Right now we're kind of experiencing this right now in this pandemic, that capitalism tends to lend itself toward a boom and bust sort of cycle, where we have periods of raging growth followed by recessions or depressions. So we kind of get this little economic instability where it's not always a period of growth. Monopoly. So you could have one or two or a few private companies coming to monopolize a particular industry. And of course, government regulation might help to prevent that. Although if you look around, there are, say, for example, if you just look at soda, there are just a few companies, Pepsi and Coke are two, that own a lot of the carbonated beverages that you can buy. And therefore, they can kind of set the price and they control most of the marketing, even though it's not always under the name of Pepsi or Coke. A lot of them are owned by Pepsi and Coke or some parent company. And so they can control a lot of that market. Short-termism is a plague on our society, I would argue. And this is that because a lot of people are invested in the market, invested in these capitalistic companies through their corporate structure. They own stock, they own shares. Everybody's interested in the next quarterly report, right? We want to know, and we tend to want that company or that business to their stock to increase in value. Otherwise, we're going to dump it, right? This is the way, for example, Denison's endowment works. It's invested in lots of companies all around the world. And if those companies, their value is decreasing, they're losing value, Denison's probably not going to hang on to that stock very long. We tend to want that value to increase, which means that company has to keep making money. It has to keep harvesting resources. It has to keep marketing stuff or services, and it has to keep getting people to buy more stuff or services. That's the system. And if that doesn't work, that company won't make money, and no one will want to invest in it. I'll move over here. Monopsony is the idea. It's a funky word. It is the idea that the profits from capitalism are not equally distributed to all those who made the profits happen. So, for example, the company CEO might be doing very, very well from the profits. The actual people working on the assembly line, or the mechanic who's working on the vehicles, or the accountant who is working crunching the numbers, maybe they don't make as much money. And then there might be a lot of people that are working for that company that are just on hourly wages and just barely scraping by, whereas the company, the corporation, is making billions of dollars, but that person making minimum wage is just getting by or not even getting by. Immobilities means that true, capitalism can reinvent itself, but it's not all that easy to change. For example, you could say to a coal miner in West Virginia, hey, coal is a dirty fuel, stop mining coal and instead make solar panels. Okay, great, that's a lovely idea, but how is that person can't just pick up and move to a city where there's a factory making solar panels and get that job, right? People are tied to a geography, they're tied to family, they're tied to a region, they're tied to a town. And it's not all that easy to shift industry from one thing to another. Another example is, why don't we shift from using gasoline and natural gas to a hydrogen economy, right? Well, we would need to change our whole infrastructure in order to have our cars built so that they could run on hydrogen gas. It's in theory possible, but it's not that easy just to shift. So we're kind of stuck in some of the infrastructure that we have right now. Some of you noticed, like me, that your ecological footprint is very high, right? And we did that a month or two ago, back before we knew about this COVID thing. Yeah, part of that is not your fault, I would say, or my fault, and that is it's the infrastructure that we live in, right? Is the system that we live in that gobbles energy, and it's not very easy to shift to one that gobbles less energy. Finally, I saved for the last, of course, there are lots of environmental costs of capitalism because for reasons we've already talked about, it is a system built to harvest resources and to not think or have to worry too much about the limits to those resources or where the waste goes. It's a linear sort of process. Okay, so let's take a look at a few arguments against capitalism and then some counter arguments of capitalists. First of all, let's look at the corporate model of capitalism. Corporate capitalism removes the consumer from the resource and human labor base for profit. So here's what I mean by that. Let's say I buy my tomatoes from a supermarket and I have no idea where they came from or what the working conditions for the people that labored to grow those tomatoes or the pesticides or fertilizers that were used on them. I'm just buying them because they're cheap, right? Compare that with a system where I buy it from a farmer down the road and I know that person and I know that they don't use any pesticides or fertilizers on their land. I know they treat their workers well. Capitalism trends toward the corporate model where we humans who are consumers are more and more and more removed from the base of those resources. Take your cell phone, for example. It has, as we looked at some time ago, lots of metals in it that you've never heard of before, rare and precious metals that came from all over the world, lots of electronics. So where was your cell phone built? Where did all those materials come from? How were the workers treated? Where was the waste disposed of? Were there any toxic chemicals involved in that process? How would you know? You really don't know, and I don't either. So capitalism tends to remove people from the resource base and the human labor base, and therefore, since you don't have any connection, you don't have any way of commenting on that or protesting against it or controlling it in any way. We've seen this a little bit in our environmental justice section. Globally uneven regulation moves the pollution and unfair treatment to less developed areas of the world. So we might have regulations against mistreating workers or against using certain chemicals that are toxic in this country, but not every country has that. So it's fairly easy for a global corporation to say, okay, we'll just produce product X in another part of the world where they don't have labor regulation and they don't have environmental regulations, and therefore it's cheaper. We're just shifting that problem somewhere else, and that's an environmental justice issue. Resources can be privatized, but pollution is the responsibility of the public. This is the externality thing that we've talked about. So sure, you can purchase timber and make your product, whatever it is you're making, purchase palm oil and put it into food additives and things like that. But the destructive part of the timber or the palm oil production isn't your responsibility. It's the responsibility of the global public, right? And that means that you're getting a really good deal as a capitalist because you're making the profit and not having to deal with the ramifications. Finally, a system of constant growth is untenable in a world of finite resources, right? How can this keep going up forever? How can those stock prices keep rising? They can't, right? At least that's the theory. Sooner or later, we're going to run out of resources. And we've talked about scarcity and things like that earlier in the semester, so you know a little bit about that. Some counter arguments. Capitalists will argue that poverty is the worst enemy of the environment. So people living, and you can disagree with these if you want to. I disagree with some of them, but the idea is that capitalism lifts people out of poverty. And I suppose it's true if you look over the last few centuries, as capitalism has ramped up, there are more people in the world, or a greater percentage, you could say, who are living a life that is above that poverty line. So getting nations into the industrialized and post-industrialized portion of that curve does indeed lift some people out of poverty. However, it's unequal, as you know. We have a growing disparity in the wealth of the world, so that a greater and greater percentage of the wealth is held by fewer and fewer people. So it's true, more people maybe are above that poverty line than a century ago, but a whole lot more people are way below the poverty line. But the argument you hear from capitalists, people who argue that this is a good thing for environmentalism, is that it creates the greatest economic good for the greatest number of people. You can debate that. Second, global commodity market is the most efficient use of resources. So this is the idea that it would be silly and impractical to try to produce everything everywhere locally. That's crazy. So it would be, to use my tomato example, to have everybody grow their own tomatoes or import them or buy them from the farmer next door. Perhaps you could do something like that. But it doesn't work for the cell phone idea, right? I couldn't mine all those metals myself and create my own cell phone. That's really something that's a global commodity that has to come from all over the world. And that's actually the most efficient use of resources, so that we aren't trying to mine for those metals all over Earth. We're mining for them where they are the most abundant. So you could argue that capitalism is an efficient use of resources. Again, you could argue against that too. Capitalism also produces many public goods, not just bads. So that's true. I mean, you could point out some of the bad things that capitalism has produced and consumers have purchased, but you could also point out a lot of good things too. Capitalism doesn't really care. It just is going to produce whatever the consumers demand. Of course, we consumers are bombarded by marketing schemes that try to get us to purchase goods and services, whether we need them or not. As some resources become rare, market will shift to alternatives. So this is another capitalist argument that, as things become scarce or rare, we'll simply shift to some alternative. And that might be true, and there are some good examples of that. However, I'll point out that the wealthiest people in the world can afford to keep buying the rare stuff. And so that doesn't mean we will leave that resource alone, leave it in the ground, or leave it untouched. It just means some people are willing and able to pay more for it, and others can't. Okay, so of course, a lot of environmentalists have this attitude: capitalism equals death, that it's impossible. The infinite expansion of the market within the finite environmental resource base that we have, that global capitalism and global environment can't exist together, at least not for very long. And so this is the idea that ecology or environment and capitalism really are opposed to each other, that it's not really a human nature problem or an economic development problem. It is the social relationships of capitalism that are the problem, especially decoupling people who are consumers from the resource base that they're consuming. So if you think about it, many thousands of years ago, humans were very closely related to their resource base, what they were harvesting and where their water came from and where their waste went. And we've talked about this before. In our synthetic society of today, we are very far removed from it. Most people don't know where their waste goes or where their products come from. And this is a problem because even if they want to care about it, they don't really have the ability to know where it comes from and how to help that situation. So the last thought here is fundamental social change is necessary to make sustainable relations. So here's where we're headed with this. Is there such a thing as green capitalism? Is there a way capitalism could exist or does exist in a way that protects and nurtures natural resources? If so, what would that look like? If not, are there other alternatives that we should think about in terms of an economic system that would actually prioritize environmental situations instead of making more environmental problems? So we'll pick up with this next time. Just want to alert you, I'm going to post another video here shortly after this one. That is the instructions for your second ENVS 100 paper, second paper of the semester, which will be due in about 4 weeks or so. That's about what we have left. So take a look at the next video to learn about that paper and the expectations for that. Have a good day, and I'll talk to you later.